Hey guys, this is Rich. Welcome back. We recently moved to a new camera system for underwater filming on a diver's life. I found few camera and camera system reviews really focused in any detail on making the switch for underwater cinematographers. Several of our viewers felt this too, and several requested that we create a technical video on the selection and configuration of our new rig. This will be our first technical video for the channel, and we would love to hear feedback on what you think of it, what things we can improve on, and so forth. This presentation will be divided into two parts. In this video, I will talk about the camera and configuration choices. In the second video, I will talk about the housing, wet lens system, lenses chosen, and the addition of a larger display and recording device. So let's talk about the camera switch itself first. I recently switched from the Panasonic GH5s to the Sony A7S III. I want to start by saying I love the Panasonic GH5s. It is a great camera and we still use it from time to time. I like the overall design premise. This camera was designed for video and not for photography. It has a 10 megapixel sensor, but the individual pixel sensors are much larger than those of the Panasonic GH5. So they are more light sensitive than the GH5. We film underwater, and this is essential. The GH5s is a micro four thirds mirrorless camera and had great depth of field. It does not have a full frame sensor. The menuing system is laid out for vloggers and it is easy to use. In the end, it was a great decision. We are a YouTube channel and focus on visual storytelling, not on taking pictures. My reasons for moving from the GH5s to the Sonys are as follows. Better focusing. GH5s focusing is terribly slow and not great for underwater. As you will see, the Sony has amazing focus tracking. I'm looking for it being better in low light. The GH5s was already great. I was looking for log and hybrid log support to better facilitate post-editing. I wanted 4K 60 frames per second 10-bit video. When shooting our Rappel video, I shot 4K video for the first time, and 10-bit color at 30 frames per second was amazing. I had only an 8-bit option on 60 frames per second. I wanted image stabilization. GH5s had none. Better technical support. Unlike the GH5, the GH5s firmware seldom got updated with new features. I was looking for a better support ecosystem. For gear and informative videos, Sony has it all. Sony had improved their menuing system and custom white balance, which were outstanding on the GH5s. I wanted a more fully functional camera that would push my knowledge, essentially stretch me. Sony claimed a similar design philosophy, a 12 megapixel sensor and larger photo sites that aid in low light situation. It is a low light beast. I looked at the Canon EOS R5 and the Sony A1. They are better suited for taking pictures. Both are great cameras, but they were not designed for low light and filming, having more similar photo sites. Both support 8K, and the Canon had 8K overheating issues, and my 5-year-old iMac could not keep up with editing files of this size. Compressed 4K videos is already a stretch for the computer. Finally, the Sony A1 is crazy expensive. So the Sony arrived, and now what? The Sony arrived, and the realities of switching to a new camera showed up. Sony is misleading in their hype about the 12 megapixel sensor. My early test run showed noise in different ISO ranges, and those ranges were based on the color profile used. The Sony A7S III does not have a 12 megapixel sensor. A recent article by Landing Field showed that a Sony A7S III damaged by a laser light show contained an IMX510 sensor and under a 50x microscope actually had a 48 megapixel resolution. So to produce 12 megapixels, you have a 2x2 binning design where 4 photo sites are combined to produce a single value. The sensor is actually a quad Bayer sensor. I have a link to this in the description. As a low megapixel sensor, quad Bayer sensors create a better sensitivity in low light situations. As a high megapixel solution, each photo site or pixel pulls in its own color data, which is great in direct sunlight. The quad-wire sensor is technically a high-resolution, high-pixel pitch sensor, but with intelligent processing in the analog-to-digital conversion. The sensor can play two different roles: superior 4K low-light performance, a high-pixel pitch sensor that can produce 8K images. The reason you need bigger photosites for low light is that as the light decreases, so does the density of the amount of photons. Having a bigger photosite allows the surface to capture a signal from a larger area to maintain an acceptable voltage. For Sony, this also reduces development costs as you can repurpose the sensor instead of making a new sensor targeted for video. Supposedly, this 2x2 binning of a 48 megapixel camera addresses this. My experience is that although the cameras worked well in low light, there are areas within the ISO range that generate a lot of noise. When you switch from an analog to a digital conversion and programmatically compute a new digital representation, you are subject to accuracy issues, which could be manifested as noise. Whereas a single large sensitive photosite over 2x2 binning, the data would be more accurate and reliable. What had proven to be a vast improvement over the Panasonic is the focus tracking. If a subject is far away, say 20 meters, your camera will constantly hunt to try to focus on the subject. When shooting in wide angle, I was advised to set the focus once and leave it to avoid this hunting effect. What I have found out is that tracking subjects like turtles on the move when less than 12 meters away, continuous autofocus is spot on and tracks extremely well in clear conditions. This is a huge improvement. Sony did in fact improve their menuing system and white balance issues. White balance could be a little better, but it is no worse than the GH5s. The big negative thing about the Sony is its stingy 3-inch display size, which is smaller than my Panasonic. Our first video with the Sony, we shot the Himmelhooker wreck at night. The display was small, but usable enough to film the wreck. However, in the daytime and in a Nauticam camera housing, it was very hard to film due to the glare. My early daytime videos with the Sony were dreadful as the glare and the tiny size prevented you from really looking at what you were filming. Clearly, Sony was targeting more professional camera people who hooked in a larger display to do filming. I ordered the new Atomos Ninja 5 Plus, so if you buy this camera for underwater cinematography, get ready to lay out some bucks. The Ninja 5 Plus was $1,500, and then there is the housing, the vacuum system, the HDMI 2 cable, ball mounts, etc. Cha-ching! More on the Ninja in the next video. Now configuring the Sony. Let's start with the codec file format settings for storing the files in. We're going to look at the list that we have here. We're going to go through each one of these. There's XAVC HS4K. This is the most compressed format with the newer H.265 compression, but many graphics cards don't support it, so this is out for me. Then you have XAVC S4K. This uses H.264 compression, which I do use with my editing software now, and it does support 120 frames per second. Unfortunately, it uses this long GOP compression, which is quite taxing on the computer, and until I update my computer to a more powerful one, this doesn't really work out. Then you have XAVC-S HD. This is the same as 2, but for HD videos. Next is XAVC-SI 4K. This is the least compressed format, but of course the file sizes are huge. It has a bitrate of 600 megabits per second, and it supports 10-bit 422 at 60 frames per second. This uses intercompression and is more suitable for editing than the long GOP compression format. In other words, it doesn't tax your computer as much. And finally, you have an XAVC-SI HD. This is the same as 4, but for HD videos. I use XAVC-SI 4K, and I use this because it is the least taxing on my computer. It supports 600 megabits per second, 10-bit 422 at 60 frames per second. So high quality color, and it's something that I can work with in post. In the future, I may go to XAVC-S4K, but that's a while down the road. I need to update my machine. If you want to know, I have like a 4 or 5 year old iMac. 4K does tax it for sure. So movie settings, I record at 60 frames per second. This allows me to take the video and slow it down. If I want to do things in slower motion, it's evenly divisible by 2 to the 30 frames per second that I actually deliver all my videos in today. It is important to note that the Sony does overheat when recording over 60 frames per second. At 25 Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit, when recording over 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second, the Sony overheats after an hour. When recording at 120 frames per second, it overheats at after a half hour. My experience was the Sony shows the overheating indicator when recording at 60 frames per second, although not continuously, for 70 minutes. This was in 27 degrees Celsius water and in a housing. This is more than acceptable, and although the Sony showed an overheating indicator, it did not stop working. I shoot for the highest quality, which is at 600 megabits per second, 422, 10-bit color. If you think about these movie settings in the codec selection, what I'm trying to do is shoot for high quality color, flexible recording speeds, and the reduced computer requirements during post-production at the expense of greater disk space. Disk space is relatively inexpensive. Although I record my content in 4K, I deliver my content downscaled to 1080p video for performance. And you still retain sharpness. You are basically scaling down the video 50%. However, if you scale down by only 60 or 70%, you make your image larger and still retain the sharpness. This is not unlike shooting pictures with a very large sensor, say 48 megapixels, and then picking a part of the actual picture and still having a great detail in your results. Let's scroll down to Proxy Settings. The Sony will actually generate proxy files for you, and some people like to use proxies to speed up the editing process. This is not another level of work that I want to deal with. I rather deal with the files as they are, and when the computers get faster, then I'll be better off. It's just not something I'm interested in working with. Let's go down to shooting mode. Exposure mode. I always shoot in manual. I think this is the best thing for filming underwater. Some people want to use automatic settings on their camera. I may use autofocus, occasionally continuous autofocus, but beyond that, white balance, the exposure levels, all of these things, aperture, I set these while I'm filming because it depends on what you're shooting. If you restrict yourself, you're not going to be very creative in doing what you want. And also, you're not going to get the best shot you want in most cases. The next important thing is the selection of the Sony picture profile. The Sony has a standard picture profile, and it also has S-Log2, S-Log3, Cine 1 through 4, HLG, and HLG 1 to 3. Standard picture profile off, or PP off, is for people who don't want to do color grading, but your exposure and white balance need to be spot on. In other words, you have to get it perfect the first time. Many people believe the best picture profile is based on which one has the most dynamic range. For the A7S3, that would be S-Log3, which has 13 stops of dynamic range. However, the Sony has what appears like dual ISO, and there are ranges that vary across picture profiles where outside these clean ranges, you get unacceptable noise. The second ISO range for S-Log3 starts at 12,800 ISO, which is crazy bright. And add to that, you need to overexpose the video to get the best quality and then reduce the exposure in post. It is also a very noisy camera. In short, it is a real pain in the behind working with underwater. In order to be working with it, you have to close your aperture down, often as up to f20 or f22, and then you are using the aperture to control pretty much just the ISO so that you can see what you are filming, and not using it as a vehicle to control depth of field. I could use an ND filter, but no. Also, distinguishing when you have overexposed too much. Add to that, you're trying to maintain good buoyancy, swim in a current, regularly updating your white balance and exposure, dealing with moving clouds overhead and marine life that is moving. No way. To learn more about these picture profiles, you should watch Gerald and Dunn's video on picture profiles and exposure. This was a huge eye-opener for me. I have provided a link in the description. This is a table of the base and extended ISO range for the picture profiles. So what do you choose? Well, I have these criteria. What can give me the great dynamic range? What gives me a less flat color when filming underwater? I like to be inspired, and a total flat image does not do it for me. Relatively easy to work with in production and post-production. So for now, I have chosen HLG3. It has 12.3 stops of dynamic range, which is almost that of S-Log3, which is 13. It has a minimal gap between the high end of the base ISO range and the second ISO range, and allows for creativity in that I don't need to use Aperture solely for controlling the exposure. With HLG3, you can start at 100 ISO, and when you get to about 1200 or 1600, then I switch to the native ISO of 2000 to get out of the noise. I have shot up to 6400 ISO with no distinguishable noise underwater. Since HLG3 is a hybrid log format, you have more to work with in post. It is important to note that the Sony records these files in BT 2020 ultra high definition format for color design for higher end 4K television sets. We discussed which picture profile I chose and why. Let me just show you how you set it. So if you go down to color tone, right on the picture profile, it's PP8. And if you're taking a look at PP8, you'll see that it has a gamma of HLG3, which is what we want. The color mode is BT 2020. This was a standard that was created to address higher resolution television sets, but the problem you have is not everybody has those sets today. So if you want to hit the widest audience, especially for YouTube, you really should be working off Rec 709. That's my opinion. And the way that you can convert this is you take a LUT or a lookup table and you apply that in post. It's very easy to do. So this is how you choose HLG3. Let's take a look at focusing. So when you're filming underwater, you have this function key right here. And this gives you access to a lot of different settings that you can set quickly. One of those is the focus area. And you have different types of focus areas you can use. You got wide, you have zone, center fix, a small, medium, or large spot, and an expanded spot. I have been using center fix for my focusing. The focus area setting is applied whether using continuous autofocus or whether you press autofocus on in manual focus mode. I have also been trying spot. There are two types of focus. You have manual focus or continuous autofocus, which is AF-C. Manual focus, and you're shooting in wide angle. You usually want to shoot something at your foot, and then you want to set it and forget it. Now I'm going to focus on this little thing, and that's in focus. You can also shoot in continuous autofocus. If you go over here, this is continuous autofocus here, and it's constantly focusing, and I've actually shown to me that this actually worked extremely well, far better than the Panasonic. In the next clip, you're going to see how this actually worked extremely well when we're filming on the East Coast. In this clip, I am focused on the Gorgonian, and a green sea turtle swims in from the right. Here, I next direct my camera to the turtle as it starts to swim by Doreen. The camera's autofocus immediately directs itself to the turtle and stays on it throughout its trajectory, sharp as a tack. You can see every detail of that turtle. In this slow motion clip, another turtle is too far away. The ocean floor is an amazing detail, but as we switch to the turtle in the distance, the Sony's focus hunting is very visible as the turtle goes in and out of focus. So let's talk about white balance. I got a piece of white paper. I'm putting it in front of the camera lens, and I'm going to hit C1. I use a custom white balance. This is really important for filming underwater. Water is seldom clear, and white balance varies with depth and available light. Your camera will use this information to remove whatever color you have that is not making it white and removes it. This clears up a lot of your video. And you want to be able to do this white balance every 3 meters or 10 feet. If you are filming close to an object with lights, you will want to redo your white balance. Maybe you're putting it to sand or something white that you have, or maybe a gray card to set your white balance. And how you do this is you hit the right arrow, okay, to ISO, hit set, and then
Sony has what appears to be a white balance bug, which I managed to catch. Myself and another German cinematographer, Christian, found the Sony changing colors underwater. It appears to be white balance related. Here Ivana is wearing a purple dive skin that appears blue. The Sony then switches color to purple. Back to blue. And back to purple. This is a serious bug. I am not adjusting lights or camera settings.
All right, let's talk about setting your ISO settings for exposure. You do this obviously while you're in the middle of a dive, and I'm going to hit this. This is on the right-hand side of the display wheel. And so you have different ISO settings. You can scroll up, right, down. We talked about the ISO ranges earlier that you can use. But let's say you're going to set it, this is the start of HLG3, 2000 ISO. Hit click, you're done. So that's how you set your ISO, very easy. And you can see it on the bottom right of the display. Okay, so the next thing we need to talk about is stabilization. Hit the FN button or function. And at the bottom row, you'll see steady shot. Click on that. And you have active stabilization, which is very smooth. And you can see a number of videos online where they've actually done this. It gives great stabilization, but it crops your video. And then you have standard stabilization. And then you can have none. I use standard stabilization. It's better than on the Panasonic, but it's not as good as active stabilization. I use this in wide angle and do a lot of my stabilization in post. But when I go to macro video work, I'm going to probably use more of the active stabilization because it is noticeably better in terms of its stabilization capability.
Next thing you need to do is you need to be able to set the shutter speed. And usually this is 1 over twice the frame rate. This is located on the lower left of your screen. I shoot at 60 frames per second, and the closest I can get is 1 over 125 or 100 twice the 60 frames rate per second, which would be 120, and this is 1 over 125, and you can change this with the rear dial here. Also, you want to be able to set the aperture, and if you look, the aperture can be set on this front dial here on the front of the Sony, and this really important to know these areas because these are things that you can set very easily in your camera housing. So you can see here I'm setting the aperture speed. F11 is something I shoot with a lot at night with lights. Sometimes in the daytime, you want to close your aperture down if it's really bright, depending on your depth. And you might go up to something like F16 or F18, something like that, that actually closes it down. One thing I also wanted to point out is the mode that we're actually in. So if you look here, you see what looks like a little film strip on the left. That's movie mode. That's where we want to be in when we're filming underwater and we're making those changes. You don't want to be messing with the mode dial. That takes forever underwater. You're going to lose your shot.
For underwater filmmakers, I hope this helps you get up to speed on the Sony A7S3. And for those of you just getting into underwater film production, beyond, say, a basic action camera, I hope this helps send you on your way. Finally, I want to give a huge thanks and shout out to the guys at ReFoto in Florida. I have found these guys to be the best place to buy your underwater equipment. Their customer service is off the charts. You can call them and they respond immediately or the same day to answer your question. Other shops I have dealt with have been more interested in getting the sale and aren't really there to help you get over the learning curve or resolve issues. For a shop, Reef's video knowledge exceeds any other shop I have worked with in the US. People on their staff actually are shooting underwater video and doing it regularly. You will learn more how awesome these guys are in the follow-on video when I talk to you about integration with the Atomos Ninja 5 Plus. The Reef photo guys really rock. And by the way, they're not paying me to say this. So thank you for watching. And if you like this video, please give a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you.
The water and sky, reflection in my eye, and it's true.
Thank you for watching.